Thanks to Baron of Dice, Grey Matter Gaming, and Monument Hobbies for sponsoring this video.
Warhammer Age of Sigmar's 4th edition is right around the corner, and a new edition means new rules. Whether you're a veteran of the Realmgate Wars or a new player, there's a lot to learn and unlearn before you can start conquering opponents in the new edition. I'm Campbell McLaughlin, plate mail enthusiast and proponent of the Sigmar mail grind set, and today I'm going to be your guide, covering what's new and what's changed in Age of Sigmar 4th edition. If you'd rather read this than listen to me yammer on about it, check out the written article on Goonhammer.com. Links in the doobly-doo. Overview. Let's start with the basics. If you're a returning player, this is still Age of Sigmar. There are a ton of changes from how rules are laid out to how combat happens, but this is largely going to feel like the same game you already know and love. It's worth talking about how the rules are laid out. The rules for 4th edition have been divided into two parts. The core rules, which are used for every game mode and includes rules for things like moving, shooting, and fighting, and the advanced rules, where you'll find rules for things like magic, terrain, and battle formations. The rules have also been streamlined. One big change is that everything a unit can do is now a capital A ability. Things like moving use the same rules framework as fighting or casting spells. It might seem complicated, but it makes sense once you get to grips with it. The big changes. Objectives have changed, and control range is now 3 inches. Turns no longer have subphases. Commands during an opponent's turn always happen last, so no more interrupting. Combat ranges have been streamlined, and are now all also 3 inches. War Scroll characteristics have changed. Bravery is out, control is in. Terrain has changed in a big way, and now uses a set of consistent keywords that describe what each piece does. Priests and manifestations got a complete overhaul, with a whole new system for answering prayers. Command abilities have changed, with a heavier focus on acting during your opponent's turn. Army construction uses a new system called regiments, and changes how armies deploy. Taking a double turn now limits your ability to score. Underdog mechanics have been added to every mission, which should make for closer games. How to play. The core principles of Age of Sigmar remain intact in this new edition. You're still going to be moving, shooting, charging, and casting spells while you capture objectives and accomplish secondary missions. Most of the game has been streamlined in the new edition, with simplified timing and a focus on making where and how to use abilities more clear. The turn. In each turn, the active player takes actions, followed by their opponent. Turns in 4th edition consist of 7 phases, and the familiar order of hero phase, movement, shooting, charging, then combat remains intact. Battle shock is gone, more on that later, and there are 2 new phases: start of turn and end of turn. Most importantly, how turns flow and how players interact with each other has changed, and that's all due to abilities. This is the biggest change in the entire edition. Now everything a unit can do has become a capital A ability, with clear rules for when and how you declare the ability and its effect. And when we say everything, we mean everything. Even basic actions like moving and attacking are abilities. Each ability has a timing. When you declare it, its effect, describing what it does, and one or more associated keywords, such as attack, core, or spell. Note that some abilities are passive, meaning that they're always in effect. In 3rd edition, both players might have abilities which could happen at the end of a phase, during a phase, or some other time during the game, leading to a back and forth of complex interrupts and priority considerations. Those days are gone. Now when a phase begins, the active player uses any and all of their phase abilities, followed by their opponent. The only exception to this is the combat phase, where players use non-fight abilities in the typical order, then alternate using fight abilities, much like the fight phase in the previous editions. There are also some reactive abilities, which can be used when a specific event triggers them, such as being targeted by an attack. All-Out Defense, for example, lets you spend a command point to get +1 to your saves in response to being targeted by an attack ability. Abilities have limits. A unit cannot use more than 1 core ability per phase, and they can't use the same ability more than once per phase unless specified. In the core rules, this is called the rule of one. A unit also cannot benefit from the same passive ability more than once, so stacking repeated buffs or debuffs to a unit are a thing of the past. Some abilities may also be limited to one use per phase, turn, or battle. War Scrolls. War Scrolls should look familiar, but there are two big changes here. The wound characteristic has been renamed to health. Easy enough. Bravery is gone and has been replaced by Objective Control, a characteristic which determines each model's ability to exert control on an objective marker. These are pretty straightforward, and Objective Control will be familiar to 40k players. We'll talk about it more in a bit. To go with these changes, 4th edition adds a handful of universal weapon special rules, most of which has been given easy to understand names. These are abilities like Strike First and Anti-Charge +1 Rend. Movement and Coherency. Movement is basically the same as it was in 3rd edition. The big difference is you now have 3 different core movement abilities: Move, Run, or Retreat. Executing a run or retreat will make you ineligible for other options like shooting or a charge later in the turn, which should be familiar. Critically, many different abilities can count as a run or retreat, and the keyword at the bottom of the action box will tell you what they do. Retreating will also cause your unit to suffer D3 mortal damage as they pay for your cowardice. Some changes have been made to movement and coherency, mostly requiring your units to stay closer together. Your models need to be within half an inch of another model in their unit, and coherency is not something you check later in the turn anymore. You have to always maintain coherency. If your unit has 7 or more models, then each model in the unit must be within half an inch of at least 2 other models. When removing models, you have to remove the minimum number of models to stay in coherency. The battle sequence. At the start of the battle round, players determine who the active player is. In the first round, the player who finished deploying first chooses, and in later rounds, you have a priority roll to determine which player chooses. This is just a roll-off, and if the players tie, then the player who went first last round determines who goes first in the new round. That's mostly unchanged from 3rd edition, but there are a few new quirks to this in 4th. First, there's the underdog. At the start of each round, the player with fewer points is the underdog. Battle plans in 4th edition typically give the underdog some kind of boost. Second, the double turn is still a major part of Age of Sigmar, as the player who went second in the previous round can still win priority and opts to take the first turn in the following round. However, this now comes with a key trade-off. If a player chooses to take a double turn, they do not get to select a battle tactic for that round. This limits a player's ability to score points and makes the decision to take a double turn much more tactical. Don't get at me in the comments about how much you hate the double turn. I've been reading the same posts about it for almost a decade, and I'm so tired. Combat. Units in 4th edition still charge and fight in the ways that you're used to. That said, there are still some big changes worth covering here. As we mentioned earlier, in the combat phase, the active player uses all of their non-fight combat phase abilities, followed by their opponent. Then players alternate using fight abilities, starting with the active player. The fight ability includes the option to make a 3-inch pile-in move before making your attacks. If your models are already in combat range of an enemy unit, they can't end this move any further from that enemy unit or move out of combat. Charging units are still able to pile in after completing their charge, even if they aren't in combat, and do not have to end up in combat. This might come up with units that cause mortal wounds on the charge and destroy their target unit. Combat ranges and pile-in moves. There's no more range characteristic for melee weapons. Combat ranges are now 3 inches for all units. This greatly speeds up the combat phase and reduces the amount of creative geometry players have to deal with. Additionally, units have to be visible for you to be in combat with them, so you can use walls and terrain to block charges. We'll talk more about how that works when we talk about terrain. The new combat range has interesting effects, especially when you combine it with the new coherency rules. Now, screening units is much harder. You'll need to keep your fragile units and heroes further back from the front line, or else they'll get swept up into combat. Attacks and damage. For returning players, resolving attacks and allocating damage is mostly the same as before. You still roll to hit and to wound, and your opponent rolls saving throws, applying any rend modifiers. There's an upper limit to the net modifier you can apply to hit and wound rolls of +1 or -1, and you can't improve a save by more than 1 either. Though, again, that's the net. Additionally, ward saves are no longer optional, so if you got one, you gotta use it. Allocating damage has also changed slightly. Instead of putting wound counters on specific models in a unit, you keep track of the damage points dealt to the entire unit. If at any point the damage points total exceeds the health characteristic of one of the models in the unit, you remove a model. It's a subtle change, but means you're not keeping track of wounds on a specific dude.
Objectives.
Objective markers in 4th edition are represented by 40mm circles, or bases, rather than just being an abstract point on the battlefield, and models can move over them and stand on them. Models can test objectives if they are within 3 inches of them, and do so using their new objective control characteristic. A unit can only contest a single objective per turn, and the active player has to pick which objectives each unit is contesting first if they're sitting on multiple. So no more objective control conga lines. Every model within 3 inches of an objective marker contributes to its owner's control score, and whoever has the highest control score controls the objective. Objective control is checked at the beginning of the game and the end of each turn, and you retain control of a held objective until your opponent gains control of it. Terrain is contested in the same way as objectives, but you don't need to keep track of who owns it, as you no longer retain control of these features after the specific end of turn check occurs. This is cleaner than the old system, where all models were created equal unless they were a hero, monster, or had some arbitrary wounds characteristic that let them count as more models. That said, abilities like a standard bearer can modify a unit's control score. This is also the part where I let you know that Gray Matter Gaming makes some lovely objective markers. How's that for brand synergy? Magic! Magic has had a massive overhaul and changed a ton. Prayers have also been completely reworked, as have endless spells, incarnates, and invocations. Magic in 4th edition refers to manifestations, spells cast by wizards, and prayers chanted by priests. You can only attempt each prayer, spell, or summoning manifestation once per turn, unless it has the unlimited keyword. The number of times a wizard can cast or unbind a spell, and the number of times a priest can chant a prayer, are indicated on the unit's war scroll, usually with something like Priest 2. Spells. Casters now need to choose a target for their spells before an opponent chooses whether to attempt to unbind them, and miscasts are now unmodified cast rolls of 2 or more 1s, suggesting that some abilities will allow you to use extra dice in your casts. Spells are abilities, which have the spell keyword and a number in the upper right corner of their rules indicating their casting value. Universal spells like Arcane Bolt and Mystic Shield are gone, so get learning those new spell lores. Prayers. Prayers are now a resource-based system, built around accumulating ritual points. When a priest chants a prayer, you roll a single die. On a 1, the priest loses d3 ritual points, and on a 2 or better, they gain a number equal to the amount rolled. These points can be spent to complete a prayer then, or saved for the following turn. When you hit a prayer's chanting value, you can spend the ritual points to gain that effect. The kicker here is that prayers tend to have 2 effects, one for a low chanting value and one for a higher one. So a priest might be able to give a single unit a 5-up ward save with a chanting value of 6, but could give the effect to multiple units with a value of 12. Prayers can't be stopped by other priests, but you can stop a priest from chanting a prayer by simply killing them.
Where is your god now?
Manifestations. Endless spells, invocations, and the incarnate of Gur have all been rolled into the same set of rules, and are now called manifestations. They're now fully interactive in combat, with nearly every manifestation having a health characteristic, melee attacks, and counting as a model in movement in combat. Manifestations no longer move in each player's hero phase, and spells can't go wild. They also have counterplay now. If you don't have wizards, just go kill them. I cast Malevolent Maelstrom. I cast Sword. It shouldn't surprise any of you that I'm a sword guy. Picking spells. Spells, prayers, and manifestation lores are picked during army construction, and instead of assigning specific spells to each wizard, you'll choose a spell lore or prayer lore for all of the wizards and priests in your army to know, and they can cast any of the spells within that lore. Spells, prayers, and manifestation lores are picked during army construction, and instead of assigning specific spells to each wizard, you'll choose a spell lore or prayer for all of the wizards and priests in your army to know, and they can cast any of the spells within that lore. Commands. You're probably noticing a pattern by now, but commands underwent some changes too. To start, all commands are abilities. Units don't issue or receive them like they used to, and any unit can use a command. So trolls and stonehorns don't need a hero or totem nearby to reroll that charge. You also don't get any extra command points for having a general on the field. Instead, commands are used to accomplish special feats, like doing regular actions during your opponent's turn. At the start of each battle round, each player gains 4 command points, plus a 5th if they're the underdog. There are also a couple of ways to get extra command points through army construction. Just like the last edition, command points are a use it or lose it resource, with any unspent command points being lost at the end of the turn. A bunch of the commands in the core rules allow you to do in your opponent's turn the things you would do in your own turn, just a little worse. For example, you might be able to shoot with a -1 penalty to hit, or move a unit d6 inches instead of your full movement. There are 10 universal commands, and while we aren't going to cover them in great detail, we'll knock out the basics. We'll also make note on screen of when you can use each one and how many command points they cost. For the most part, they only cost 1. Magical Intervention lets you cast a spell or chant a prayer in your opponent's turn at -1 to the roll, helpful for getting off big prayers early. Rally lets you heal up to 6 wounds on a unit that isn't in combat or return lost models to a unit. Redeploy. One of your units can move d6 inches if they aren't in combat. Covering Fire. One of your units that isn't in combat can shoot the nearest visible enemy unit with -1 to hit. Countercharge. One of your units can charge as if it were your charge phase. Power Through. Pick a friendly unit locked in combat with an enemy unit with a lower health characteristic. That enemy unit takes d3 mortals and your unit can then move through them, and can choose whether it wants to end in combat with that unit. At the double. One unit automatically runs 6 inches so you don't have to roll. Forward to Victory. You can reroll the charge roll for a unit. All-Out Attack. Add 1 to hit rolls for a unit's attacks. This ability affects weapons that have the companion ability, so your horse's hooves or Gryph-hound's claws. All-Out Defense. Add 1 to save rolls for that unit in this phase. So let's get the big things out of the way first. Because of the rule of 1, you can't chain together command abilities. If your countercharge fails, you can't use Forward to Victory to reroll the charge. Second, reaction commands aren't locked into any specific phase. While At the Double and Forward to Victory are included in the movement and charge phases in the rules, they are activated by using a run or charge ability. The same goes with All-Out Attack and All-Out Defense. They also have keywords associated with them. For example, Redeploy has the run keyword, so you can't use shoot and charge after using it. Each of these commands has a specific use case, and all of them have their place. Because of that, having extra command points feels like a big deal, and it can mean an extra heal, more movement, or a deadly countercharge. Terrain. Terrain features now have specific keywords which determine their effect on units and the battlefield. Rolling for terrain abilities is a thing of the past. Full disclosure, I never did that. Now there are a series of universal terrain abilities which determine what that terrain does. For example, obscuring terrain blocks line of sight to units on the other side of it unless they have the fly keyword, while attacking across terrain with the cover keyword will give you -1 to hit. Impassable and unstable terrain affect movement, and terrain with the Place of Power keyword can be activated by heroes within 3 inches to gain a bonus to casts and unbinds. Faction terrain is also back, but those terrain features are treated like units for the purposes of movement and combat. So now instead of bringing a monster and hoping to use Smash to Rubble, you can just fight and shoot them normally, or use abilities to damage them. It's kind of like your typical strategy game. Battle Tactics. Okay, let's start with the best news. Faction-specific battle tactics are gone. They had a lot of flavor, but the balance was all over the place. There are a number of universal battle tactics in the core rules, but as with last edition, we expect that players will play with the ones in the most recent General's Handbook for the majority of their games. Battle tactics are now worth 4 points each, and remember, if you took a double turn, you can't score them. Building an army. Would you be shocked to hear that this changed too? The real surprise is actually how extensive the changes are. Battalions are gone completely, and sub-factions have been replaced with more generic battle formations. Likewise, armies in 4th edition are built from regiments. Speaking of, regiments. Each army in 4th edition consists of 1 or more regiments. Each regiment is led by a hero and can include up to 3 other units, or 4 if that hero is your general. An army can have up to 5 regiments, and sometimes you can add a second hero to your regiment. The hero leading your regiment determines which other units can be added to it, and these are pretty intuitive, like a Lord of Khorne being accompanied by gore-chosen units. You can still reinforce your units, doubling their points cost and unit size, but you can't reinforce any unit more than once. Note that your general doesn't have to be the one to take your heroic trait. More on those later. During deployment, each regiment is a single drop, so the number of regiments you take determines your number of drops. If you want to work outside your army's framework, you have some options. There are armies of renown and regiments of renown to work with, and units added from outside your regiments are called auxiliary units. Each of these deploys as a separate single drop, and if one player has fewer auxiliary units than the other, they get an extra command point each round. That's a huge bonus, and means you should be really considerate of when you take auxiliaries. Enhancements and spells. After picking your regiments and faction terrain, you pick enhancements. Enhancements can't go on unique units like special characters, and you're able to select one enhancement from each provided table. Every faction should have heroic traits and artifacts of power they can use, but there may be other traits specific to your faction. Next up is spells. You select one spell lore, one prayer lore, and one manifestation lore. As we mentioned before, these are available to every unit in your army from your faction. Command models. Command models for a unit are specified in that unit's war scroll, and denoted with keywords such as champion. Since units in 4th edition don't need a champion, totem, or musician to issue commands to themselves, these models now have other abilities. Champions give you an additional attack for their weapons, musicians allow for an additional die roll when using the rally command, and standard bearers add +1 to a unit's objective control score. This standardization cleans up war scrolls, and will make it easier to remember what units do across armies. Putting this all together. If you couldn't tell, that's a lot. And there's plenty of minutia and tiny details we didn't have time for. Players will discover those particulars as they play more of the edition, but we've covered what we think are the important changes here. As we said, the game is still recognizably Age of Sigmar, but enough has changed that players will need to get used to the new game and how it's formatted. We're guessing it'll take most players 3 or 4 games to unlearn old habits and learn the new mechanics well enough to begin playing with confidence. I've got 4 editions rattling around up here, and by God, I'm gonna get things wrong. Once you get the hang of these new rules and mechanics, there's a lot to love here. The way abilities are written in the new edition is clearer than ever and should speed up play. Universal weapon abilities are gonna make it easy to understand what a unit is supposed to do with just a glance at their war scroll. The simplification of spell lores and the changes to prayers and manifestations make those feel substantially different, with welcome counterplay for each. And with core command abilities and more points to work with, players can be more active in their opponent's turns. Hopefully we've given you a solid starting point to work from when it comes to getting started with Scaventide in 4th edition, and you're as excited as we are to play the new edition. If you like what we're doing, please consider supporting us on Patreon, where you can get access to our Discord, a first go at tickets for our events, extra features in the Tabletop Battles app, which has Age of Sigmar support by the way, and early access to videos just like this one. We'd also like to thank our sponsors, Baron of Dice, Monument Hobbies, and Grey Matter Gaming, for making this video possible. I'm Campbell McLaughlin, reminding you all that Sigmar is real, and also my dad. Thanks for watching.